Welcome back. Happy May, Richard.
Yeah, it's May, early May,
Yes.
and as many of you know, May is Mental Health Awareness Month.
Yes, it is. Yes,
Um,
it is.
and so we're going to be discussing issues related, we will continue discussing issues related to mental health. You might see reminders, notifications, invitations for activities throughout the month of May. And we want to join that and address these topics as well in the next 4 weeks.
Absolutely. And we're going to take a slightly
Right.
different approach in some ways. You know, it's Mental Health Awareness Month, and one of the things that we're going to focus on is mental wellness. And
Exactly.
so we're going to start out today talking about happiness. And happiness is something that's is a really interesting word and interesting topic for us because people come in and people use phrases like I deserve to be happy. I deserve happiness in my life, and I'm never quite sure what deserve means in those kinds of statements. Um,
Deserve. Yeah.
what does it mean to deserve to be happy?
Right.
But we found this article by Derek Thompson in The Atlantic from just about a week ago, and we thought that it was perfect timing for the topic that we wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, right. As we noted, May is Mental Health Month, but instead of talking about mental illness and the increasing rates of mental illness, we thought, let's talk about mental wellness. Let's talk about mental health. That's the other side of that coin. And I fear that most of us don't spend enough time talking about that. So we thought an appropriate place to begin with would be this article that we ran into called The Happiness Trinity. It was written in response to a new book by Brad Wilcox. He's a professor of sociology, and he's the director of the National Marriage Project. So you can sort of get a hint of what this is going to be about. But he says there in the article, he talks about three pillars of happiness. And I've discussed this with some colleagues, some friends, and they're not psychologists, but they're professionals, and they were really intrigued by, oh, okay, yeah, I want to know more about that. Okay, well, what Wilcox talks about in his book, the first thing he says, to be happy, and you mentioned earlier, Bernie, you mentioned that this whole thing about happiness, I deserve to be happy, but what is happiness? And there's another phrase that we're going to use later in the podcast. Um, and the term this man uses is thriving in well-being. Okay. And I think that's probably closer to what people really mean by happiness. And that's where, as we go through this podcast, you're going to see that we're going to move a little bit from happiness to well-being. There's another concept here that we want to talk about.
Right.
But the first thing Wilcox talks about is the importance of marriage.
Right. Which is interesting because we hear you hear so many varied things when it comes to marriage, right? We hear about here we have someone talking about one of the main pillars of happiness or thriving or what I would call also life satisfaction
Mhm.
is marriage. And he says when it comes to predicting overall happiness, a good marriage is far more important than how much education you get, how much money you make, and how much intimacy and how satisfied you are with work. All those things, having a good, strong marriage is a better predictor of happiness and overall life satisfaction than any of those other things. And in the midst of the statistics, like 50% or so of marriages end in divorce, and we have so many blended families with
Right.
stepchildren and step parents and all of that stuff. Living in a world where that is so common now, it's interesting and good to see that still, if you have a good marriage, um, that leads to some really good feelings and happiness about with your life in general.
Right. And you think about all the jokes that have been made about marriage and how hard it is, and it's the most difficult thing I do, and I don't know. And yet, in all of the studies that have been done, this marriage continues to percolate to the surface as a predictor of happiness or less worry, less sadness, less stress, less anger. It's associated with all those positive things. And there was another study done by another economist, and he was studying the decline in happiness between 1970 and 2020. And he said, adjusting for everything else, gender, age, national origin, race, one thing explained the decline in happiness in America, and that is the decline of marriage during that same period. So he correlated those two things.
Yeah,
So for whatever reason or reasons, marriage is a very robust predictor of what most of us consider happiness or well-being,
yeah.
mental health, mental wellness.
Absolutely. And we already knew, and it's great that this writer just makes it very direct and can point it to that
Mhm.
happiness, or
Right.
using a word that most people would use on a daily basis, wanting to be happy.
Mhm.
I like that this writer did that, because we do know from research that people who have a good, healthy marriage, they tend to live longer. They tend to,
Right.
have more experiences in life and more life satisfaction. And so we already knew that, but again, connecting it to that overall sense of happiness, sense of mental well-being, I think is a great connection, and really an important connection.
Right. And so, if you're married, you may want to work a little bit harder to protect that marriage, to work a little bit harder at it, because it is a fundamentally important aspect of your overall mental wellness. So don't take it for granted. I mean, this is, people exercise and we change our diets and we eat certain foods. Boy, I think I would begin by advising, if you're married, do all that you can to maintain a healthy marriage, because that's going to be the best predictor of how you're feeling.
Absolutely. And for those that we've worked with who have been married a couple of times, because
Right.
that's certainly a large percentage of the population, um, when they do have that marriage that is very solid and satisfying, you can see that happiness and overall well-being change. We can see that here in our practice, and
Right.
and it leads to the second pillar very nicely, because
Right.
marriage is companionship, marriage is partnership, and so it makes sense that one of the other pillars of happiness is social fitness. It is your social and emotional well-being when it comes to interactions with other people.
That's right. And that's the other pillar, the second pillar. And the term they use in these articles is social fitness. I think most of us would think in terms of friends and relationships with neighbors, or people you interact with on a social level, parties and dinners and get-togethers and celebrations that you have. And social fitness is all that you do beyond the nuclear family. In other words, you have your marriage and your nuclear family, but these other relationships, which could include other family members. And I think what we typically think about there is, if you grow up in a large family that gets together often, okay, or you have a large circle of friends, that's what gets you through the rough times that you're going to encounter in your life. And an easy, helpful way to think about it is, when you think about people who are alone and they go through holidays, or they go through, when they have crises and have nobody to talk to, nobody to turn to, it makes the crisis much worse. And so we get an abundance of support from these close relationships that we have with other people, with other family members and friends and relatives mainly, but it could be coworkers. It's people who support you and get you through life's difficulties.
Absolutely. And, if you go back and listen to any of our podcasts that we posted in 2020 or 2021, just about, we talked a lot
Mhm.
about during the pandemic, we talked a lot about the consequences of loneliness and how loneliness is one of the best predictors of depression and anxiety and
Right.
substance abuse and some of those things. And so again, it makes sense. And it's great to see someone making this direct connection between overall well-being and happiness with social interactions, or as they said, social fitness. And
Mhm.
the third pillar is a little bit more difficult, I think, because many people are a little bit more confined when it comes to this. It's something that I think a lot of people would say, but then we would back it up with, wait a minute, there are lots of things that says, can't buy me happiness. You can't buy happiness. But the third pillar is money.
Yeah, and and let's not be afraid of this. Let's just talk about it.
Yeah.
Um, there is an association with money, and it's a very interesting connection. There was a theory, I've forgotten it was named after a person. There was a theory that after a certain amount of money, it was in 2010 dollars, if you can think about what you were doing in 2010, it was about $75,000. Okay, and that at some point around $75,000, if you made more, it really didn't make you any happier. Okay, well, most of us remember that over a certain amount, like if you make $150,000, if you make 180 or 200, it doesn't buy you any more happiness. Well, as it turns out, that's been wrong. Okay, people say no, that's not true. Okay, it would be true if I make $40,000 and I get a $5,000 raise, that's a big deal. But if
Right.
I make $1 million a year and I get a $5,000 raise, it doesn't mean very much. Okay, so there's a relative element there. But let's go to the short answer. Money makes a difference.
Yeah.
Um, Plain and simple, higher income people tend to be happier. Now, there are some caveats, and there are some additions that we think that are important to make. But generally speaking, higher income people are happier than lower income people,
Mhm.
right? Why is that? One of the reasons is that higher income people are more likely to get married for
Right.
whatever reason,
Right.
and they're less likely to get divorced because of the financial consequences of a divorce.
Right. And I was going to say that I think that, there, you mentioned caveats. I think that those caveats are really important because, when it comes to, you know, a lot of people get married.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
but people who tend to be financially stable,
Hmm.
they get married for maybe different reasons than people who are not financially stable. They get
Right,
married because of a relation. There are people who get married to find financial stability. And I think that that's a very different reason to get married than having an intimate, strong relationship with someone. And
hmm, hmm,
this is not to cast any judgment on anybody for anything for any reason that they get married, but if you're getting married because you're deeply in love with a person, or you're strongly connected to a person, that's very different than getting married to someone because you're saying, hey, why not? We get help with taxes, and we can combine our money so that we can afford this
right,
apartment.
right,
That's a very different reason.
right,
So when you have that financial stability, it brings along with it less stress about some aspects of life that may help you have some other life satisfaction and life happiness.
right. Yeah, and so I think that if we keep that in mind, that higher income people are more likely to get married and they're less likely to get divorced. Because combining two incomes, if you have two professionals, it leads to greater wealth. You're going to get wealthy very fast if you combine the salaries of two well-educated professionals, say two physicians or two professors or two
Right.
dentists, you can grow wealth pretty fast if you're making that kind of money. But the author then poses the question, and he posed it to Jonathan Rothwell. And Jonathan Rothwell is Gallup, and you know the Gallup poll, that organization. He's their chief economist. And the question they posed to him, because they wanted another perspective, is what matters most? Is it marriage, social fitness, or income? And he said it's going to be a very difficult thing to answer, but let me give it a shot. So, because Rothwell has collected all these data over the course of his career, and they said, well, let's crunch these numbers. It took him a couple of days to crunch all the numbers. But here's the interesting part. Rothwell defines happiness, and he has developed a statistical measure from all of his data called thriving in well-being. And we talked about that earlier in the podcast.
Yeah.
And what it is, it's a combination of current life evaluation, how am I doing now, combined with future life evaluations. So if I am miserable right now, but things are getting better, my thriving in well-being might be a nice high score. Or if I'm happy right now, but the future looks bleak because some bad things are headed my way. So it's a combination of current and future.
Right.
And he calls it thriving. And in the article, they shorten it just to the term thriving. Are you thriving? And I think that's a nice way to think about happiness,
Yeah.
in terms of thriving. Okay. So his analysis, and this is where the money part comes in.
Yeah.
60% of married adults felt that they were thriving versus 41% of unmarried adults. So there we are with the marriage question again, that just seems like married couples are happier than. However, the highest income adults were mostly quite happy whether or not they were married.
Right.
So now we see the money factor coming into play and altering the data just a little bit. And so the highest income adults were mostly quite happy whether or not they were married.
Yeah.
Now the numbers are interesting because it says married couples who earn less than 48,000. So married couple earning less than are as happy as single adults who earn 48 to 60. So if you're making the same amount of money, marriage tends to be the deciding factor, that you're as happy as a single person. But married couples making 90 to 180 are as happy as a single person making much more than that. So
Right.
there's some interaction between being married and income level.
Right. And just, for those of you keeping note, because that was some statistical stickiness, it didn't include social fitness. It didn't
Right.
include the social relationship piece. And
Right.
so, so we don't really have that aspect, because Rothwell's statistical analysis included like education and religion and marriage and income and career satisfaction. And so when he includes all of that, again, marriage is very strongly correlated to happiness.
That's right.
And when he does look at some of those social things, and he kind of included social fitness with marriage, especially when you have those two, that's really strongly correlated with that happiness or that thriving that they talked about. So, those initial analyses that you were kind of going through were really just looking at marriage and income. But as he starts to broaden that analysis a little bit and looks at other things, and you add that social fitness in, now social fitness with a strong marriage, that's highly correlated with that thriving that we're looking for.
Right. So what we see here is we have three pillars, the three pillars of happiness. And we know that marriage is important. We know that social fitness is important. We know that income is important. As you combine the two, and we're going to talk about this at the end, as you combine two of the pillars, marriage with high income, that's going to lead to better feelings. All right. So combining two of these things is important. If you can get all three,
forget about it.
you're home. I mean,
you're Disneyland.
Right. so I think that's the importance of Rothwell's data is by combining two, you get a better effect. You get a synergistic effect.
But this last point though, Richard, I'm gonna let you go through it, but this is the one that really is interesting to me because if you had to just pick one, if you had one to
I'm
pick,
not I'm not going to do that.
okay, I'll do it. If you had just one, if you could just have just one of them, the best single predictor of thriving was income, according to their data.
Well, as it turns out, I mean, and that's what I said at the beginning, that it looks like income is really important. We know marriage is important. We know that relationships are important, but when you look at the data, just coldly look at numbers, which is what Rothwell, he's an economist. He just looked at data. Income becomes a very important part of this. Now, what Rothwell did again is he controlled for education, religion, marriage, everything. He put everything in control. What he found was marriage is strongly correlated. We know that. But he said social fitness, which includes marriage. So it's all of your relationships, marriage plus all the other relationships. That is more strongly correlated with happiness. So being married, yes. But if you include a lot of healthy relationships, friends and family, that's more strongly correlated. But the strongest predictor is income.
Yeah.
It,
And
it,
we know that
and why is that? Why? Okay, what is money really doing?
right. I mean, certainly we know that it gives you access to things.
That's what.
It relieves stress from things. I mean, let's just again, you said let's just call it for what it is. There is a lot less stress when you don't have to worry about whether or not you're going to eat tonight.
If you can pay your bills, like you get a big tax bill, but if you have 50 or $60,000 in them, it's not a big deal. I can pay. I don't have that stress, let alone the necessities of life.
Right.
How am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to make my car payment? How am I going to buy my groceries? I don't want to spend $15 for a Big Mac at McDonald's. I don't have that kind of money. So yes, you remove that financial pressure, and that helps. But there are a couple of other factors, and that is that people who high income, I'm talking about high income individuals, they are able to take more vacations, they travel more, they go to more parties, they go to barbecues, they go to events, and they're out mingling more than people of limited means. If you don't have a lot of money, you can't go do those things.
Right.
And so higher income people, we know they tend to get married and stay married, but they also have a richer social life.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
that's I think what the income brings you. It reduces stress, reduces financial stress, but um, it also gives you access and gives you a richer social life. And that's what that social fitness is all about.
Right. Now, so as we bring this all together and hopefully we didn't lose everybody with everybody saying, well, my income is what it is, and so it doesn't look like I'll ever be happy. That's not what we want you to take from this. What we want you to take from this is that while income is the single strongest predictor, and if you include that into the analysis,
Mhm.
it's always going to get stronger. What we want you to recognize is that the happiness trinity, as this is we're calling this, includes marriage and close and supportive relationships.
Right. Right.
If you have just those two,
Hmm.
you don't have to have, if you don't have the income, or if your living situation or your life situation is such that you can't do much about your income, if you focus on those other two, work to keep your marriage strong, work to keep and build strong social ties
Right.
and connections with other
Mhm.
people, that's going to lead to good happiness as well. Remember, that was a strong predictor of happiness. And
Right.
so if you could just have two of them, then your probability of happiness is still really strong. It's still really good. And those are two that you have much more control over maybe than that third, that income. We don't always have a lot of control over our income, but we have more control over our relationships.
Yeah, and I think that one other point that's worth making is that yes, income is important, all right? But if you have a healthy marriage and you have strong social connections, you have a nice friend group that is supportive, income will help if those two things don't change.
Right.
But if in raising your income, you start to work 80 or 90 hours a week and you ignore your marriage and you ignore your friends and you don't socialize, well, now you've traded
Right.
two other healthy pillars for one pillar.
Right.
So that's where it's not just income, because
Right.
if you're working 80 hours a week, you're not going to be taking care of the other parts of your life.
Right.
Okay. And so that's where you have to be careful. There are many people. I grew up in a very large Italian family, and nobody had a lot of money, but everybody was mentally healthy
Right.
because you had this large supportive network. And you, Bernie, you come from a big family,
Yeah.
and it's a supportive family. I mean, they were always there. You knew that they were always there. And that gives you a comfort that is very hard to replace.
Yeah.
If you then go out and separate from them so that you can make a lot of money, you've given up two of the pillars.
Right.
And that's what you have to be careful of, is you don't sacrifice. The best combination is all three, but at least if your income is limited, at least you can work on the other two.
Absolutely. And two's not that bad. 2 out of 3 isn't
Two is
that
good. No, two is good.
so.
Three is the best, but 2 out of 3 is would get you into Cooperstown Hall of Fame if you were a baseball player, because
That's
you'd be
right.
batting, you'd be doing well. So
That's right.
2 out of 3 is perfectly okay.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's it for today. We want to wish everyone a very happy mental health awareness month, and we're gonna throw out a few extra podcasts this month. We're gonna start trying some new things around here and see if we can share a little bit more. So be on the lookout. Make sure that your podcast and YouTube feed is
Up to
subscribed so
speed.
that you can, huh?
Up to speed. Make
Up-
sure everything is working. Make sure
That's
it's
right.
humming along.
That's
Because
right. We will be
more
in
to
your
come.
we'll be in
Yeah.
your notification box again in a few days. So until then, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.